Hello, my name is Dr. Aaron Dishno, and I'm going to continue working on WalkTheWeb 3D Internet. Today's a coding time, so basically I'm going to be coding away, talking as I do it, and kind of giving everybody a heads up of where I'm at and what I'm doing. If you're looking for a display, be able to see, some show and tell kind of stuff and Q&A, then every Monday at noon I'll be doing that. And hopefully as I go along in this, I'll get far enough away that I can start showing you what we've done during the week and everything. So right on to coding. Okay, there we go. And okay, first of all, a little breakdown, just to give you a little heads up of what I'm working on here. What I have in my, first of all, develop environment, I'm keeping it simple. We have Notepad++. It's a free program. Anybody can get it, so trying to keep it as simple as possible and familiar as possible with programmers. I have a couple different things open right now, but the main ones are 3d.walktheweb.com is my hosted site, and 3d.http3d.net is a site that I'm using to create the open source version of it. Now, the reason there's two different versions is the hosted site is designed for a high degree of separation between different users on there. So if you create a site and you have accounts and different things on there, there's a high degree of separation between that and the next user. And as I keep going on the open source, there is a bit of that too. So it's not, let's say I did overkill on my own hosted site. So the other part is there's a couple things that I have. I have a 3dnet.walktheweb.com. This is actually my pulse for multiplayer use. So whenever I have something that's going to be hosted by my main server for community use, such as chatting and also positions of multiplayer users and stuff, I'll be using that site, and at least till we figure out a better way to do it or an alternative that we want to go with or adapt. So at this time, I'm in the middle of, I've started by copying over a copy of the hosted site, and then I started pruning down things that would fall under a plugin versus a core code of the site. Next, I started converting database entries. Before I used a couple constants, went directly to the database and was doing stored procedures in MySQL. Well, now the change is that I'm going to be using I'm still using MySQL, but what I'm going to be doing is I'm wrapping everything into classes for the PHP, and also I'm using a couple PHP, I've got a class for a database use, and I'm calling the queries through that database class. So it's going to standardize depending on what you're trying to do. It's going to standardize how or which class you're going to need to do certain functions. That kind of sums it up. As I go, I'll talk to you about what it is and how I packaged it so that you can see exactly where it's at. I've streamlined exactly what's in this site so that I can make it as easy as possible. And yes, even though I'm sitting on a web server that's IIS right now, it will work on Apache. I've done no special coding other than the web.config that wouldn't work in both places. So with Apache, we just have to configure it separately. Okay, so in the home site, as you can see, the only thing really here is the index and the admin site. Difference between those two is the admin is where you're working on your site and tends to have a higher load because it's where you're modifying your site, where the index page is you're strictly browsing the site and its user functions and actions. I separated the two into two different pages mainly because I wanted to be able to keep the index.php as light as possible and working as fast so that it works on all devices with no trouble. If you're going to configure your site and everything else, I don't think it's too much to ask that say, hey, jump on a desktop or laptop and you'll have some more functionality as an admin. But who knows, in the end, if I streamline it enough, it may work well from a tablet or something anyway, even in the admin mode. That's the goal, but like I said, I kept them separate because there is a lot more overhead on the admin page. Next, something as simple as a config page. This gets written by the actual install process when you drop it on your site. It will create a server. It'll create the settings config file for you. You just fill out a couple forms on the page. When it creates the file, basically it writes this to the disk. You can modify these and it will use these settings at any time. So if you need to make a change, you can just manually go in, make the change. Okay, connect directory. Connect directory, okay, I have to say it before I go on any farther. You'll notice that my 4 directories here all start with the letter C. Technically, I did 3 of them without even thinking about it, and then the 4th one I was like, wait a minute, I have a pattern here, and since I am kind of it's kind of crazy about noticing patterns and trying to complete patterns, I had to come up with a C word, and I called it core, so that I would have all my core files for running the system under that. So now all the directories just happen to start with the letter C. Okay, connect. The reason I separated these files from the rest of the files is technically these are the files that another server would browse over to get information about your sites. So I isolate them into one directory, and that's the only directory that we even have the option or that you would even want to expose certain things. Right now, while I'm building it, I've closed everything off, and that's with the header settings. So it's easy to swap and make one available to the world, but at this time I'm closing them all until we choose one at a time to expose them. While I'm developing it, there's no reason for others to be hitting this site and pulling these files. So this has to do with cross-script browser access. But it's like, for example, you're walking the web, you come up on a building, it wants to load it. Well, this is where that server would come across and grab in here, pulling the building information and bringing it back so that it can load it. So that's the kind of stuff we're exposing. If I compared it to something on a traditional web server, it would be as equivalent as downloading a web page. The only thing is we are using JSON because we're sending 3D modeling objects and all their formatting and stuff. So now with that said, you'll see there's a number of objects in here. As I go, I'll be talking about each one and what they actually do, so I'm not going to spend any time on that right now. To continue through this look of the file, we have content folder. Now content folder, we're going to have 2 things. Components, once again with the seed naming. So content, the components are going to be the plugins. So that's where we add in the functionality, and we'll get into plugin design at a later time after we finish converting the root site over. The other one is system right now, and the system files are everything from the graphics on the menu system to the initial avatars that you get when you load up the system, anything of that nature that we need for the system. In fact, if I expand it, you'll be able to see I have the root core animations for your avatars. I have the avatars. I have a Babylon directory with some sample Babylon files that you can use in your sites. I have icons for the animations. Some of those are done, not all of them are done. When we get a graphics artist that wants to spend a lot of time on that, I'll let you redo them all. So, looking for volunteers. I have the default images, and then I have some stock images that we use when we're actually using the product. This has to do with stock textures that are tileable and seamless and stuff. So, just to give you a starting packet. Now, for my system, I've taken the content directory, and on the server I've actually mapped it to another site, another folder on the server. Reason is for security purposes, and also when I do backups of my site, of the code I've changed, I don't need to recopy all my images in my content directory again. So that allows me to copy the folder real quick and drop it in my backups without, snapshot date and time kind of thing, without having to copy all the images every single time. Next is the core. This is where we're going to spend most of our time while working on the site. The core is exactly that. This will be the part that we update as WalkTheWeb. This is the stuff that is going to be the core usage and functionality of the site. I've divided things into different folders: analytics, database, form, functions, iframes, menus, pages, all the scripts, and then styles. Try to make it as simple as possible. When you go into certain directories, for example, the scripts file, I break it down even farther to what types of scripts you're going to pull up. These are the core elements, you could say, for walking in 3D. Action zones, admin, you can read them. But the idea behind these are, if you write a script, this is where you would find it. You can dig in very easily, you can find samples, it just helps with separating the script into functionality and core areas. Two to take note of at this time is I have the engine. These are ones that I'm importing into here. These are the toolkits that I'm using. Some I'm using more than others, some I'm not using at all, but I just want to be able to make them available to others that may have a site that want to use them in their code. The idea behind what I'm doing is to be all-inclusive. So I'm going to go open source with this as soon as we get the viable product ready to go. The open source is, anybody can load this up on a server and host their own 3D websites, download plugins, add them in there. We're talking freemium plugins, so developers can create freemium plugins, adding functionality to your 3D sites. And I'm going to expose all this stuff through the engine that if you say, hey, I want to use Canon physics engine or hand movements and loader and stuff, you can do these different things root from what I already package in there. If you want to do additional ones, you can always package them into your plugin directly. But this means we're kind of taking responsibility for them, and we're going to make sure that they're updated and stay compatible every time we do a release. So if we can keep it one step ahead of your plugins, then that's less trouble you'll have when working on the site. Okay, the next one I want to point out here is prime. These are the prime constructs of JavaScript and working in our site. For example, we have all the object definitions. This helps with all of the JSON that you're going to go back and forth. You can open up this file and you can take a look, and basically it'll say what it is, like a new product, or if it's meshes, molds, all kinds of different things here. You can pick out what the object is, and then you can see the definition of what we've expected or at least considered. When I code stuff, I tend to code it that if you leave something out, I fill in a default value and try to make it work with what I give it. So as long as you're providing me the core information, the site should work just fine. And then it's almost like there's a ton of optional stuff for you. So we'll keep in mind on that stuff as we go. Another one is the init. The init actually, this is the init of the actual JavaScript. We're talking about all of our event listeners and our Windows on load functions, looking for the core ones to get started and run. The next thing is the core. The core is the loading sequence of Babylon. It includes the basic functionality and the scene loop. So you can do the render loop in that area. You'll find it there. Another one is common. These are the common elements I use across the sites. Tends to be both admin and the default site. You're going to see a couple others. The constructor. This is the JavaScript constructor. It gives you all the variables that I use in the site. So if you're looking up a variable for JavaScript, here's a list of them right off the top. Easy to find, easy to use. You can pull values from them. If it's something that you need to set in your code, help yourselves. Just don't break my site, please. No. Okay, so then if you ever need anything in there, hey, request it. Let me know. I can definitely jump in there and help you out and make something more global across the board instead of just in your code. Let's see. Other things, input. Here's all the touch events, the mouse events, and the keyboard events, and where they go and what they do. Tells you what functions they hit and how I handle them, how I group them together, like bring in touch events and a click on the mouse and make them run a certain function. But you'll find all that in the inputs. The common iframe, we'll get into the iframe part. I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but this is just a common JavaScript of just the core things that I need for an iframe when I use one. And there's a cameras. I separated this out only because this is where this controls how I switch cameras, which camera you're currently using. It has some cookies to save what your configuration is of the ones you do. And it also tracks the movement of the camera as you move your avatar. And you'll see in a little while, there is a setting in admin that you can take it off so that the camera can move independent of your avatar. Very helpful when you're building things. So that's where you'll find all that stuff. We'll get into it more as we code and watch out for things as we correct errors and stuff. Okay, so that's the basics. Oh, also there's an admin directory. The admin editor is the root page for the editor. This is where you'll find all the commands that are in JavaScript that are specific to the administration of the site. So when you bring up admin, this is an addition to all the core and common stuff that you do. Okay, that should give us enough background on those areas. And now let's see. Okay, getting into a couple of these other areas, as I've said before, I've already gone through, let me close off some of these. This. Okay, I've already gone through and I've already done some code for the connect section. So those areas are in place. Just a quick walkthrough on one of the pages. I include a class WWWConnect, which if you're creating a page that you want to expose out here for this particular, or for sending information through JSON to other sites, this is the style you'd use. Require once, I've got the WWWConnect, and then everything else uses that class, and I've also inherited another class within it, which I'll show you in a minute. Basically, I bring in some query string variables, I bring up the SQL, statement is right there. Now this requirements once connect header private. Let me get into here. Functions. Connect header private, and I have one connect header world. This is where I'm actually limiting it out, where right now the allowed origin is that www.connect class domain name, which is the domain name you come in under. So if you use, if you're coming in HTTPS or HTTP, it'll count for that. But the domain name you're getting is going to be directly from that. So it allows it to be read from its own source only, whatever it is. Okay, I've got a couple things marked out right now. I'll see if I actually need them or if it's just going to inherit those from the browser. So, I held tight, didn't want to delete them just yet. The other one, if I go to the world, basically what I've done is I've changed it to a wildcard so that any website can bring open this page. Now, right now, don't even bother trying. Connect header / world is not used on any of these pages. Like I said, since I'm creating the open source, I'm not opening it up just yet. I'll open up the pages as I need to, as I test them, as I correct them, and as we get it going. Next part is I format, based on the response that I get from the SQL, I format the JSON, and you can see it's very simple, straightforward. What you're getting here, each one of these formatted, what is expected through JSON, can be found in the scripts, prime, and the object definitions. So when I'm creating, for example, in this case, I'm bringing back action zones. If you look in here, okay, I'll alphabetize these at some point, but if I come in here, find the one for action zones, and you're going to find the exact same format of how it expects the data to be seen. Now, the reason I did this is because I'm not expecting that everybody in the world is always going to use my program, and I want compatibility. I'm talking about a standard for WalkTheWeb, for 3D internet, that anybody, if you wanted to host something and you wanted to create and write your own server from scratch or whatever you want to do, you should be able to still read in other things. Okay, now licensing issues and some of the things, there's going to be some open source on what I'm distributing. Start with that. You'll save yourself a lot of time, obviously. But of course, open source, you see what I'm doing, you get to go use it and do it. I'm not stopping you, I'm just making sure it's a standard so everybody can use the same thing. Okay, so back to it. After the class that I'm using, they're all in my functions directory. So under functions, I've renamed the classes as I do them. So for in this case, the first thing I did was I read in the config file. So obviously, going back to the config here, we read that config file that gives you the database connection and the constants that we're using in our site. The next one is I'm loading the class WTW or WalkTheWeb, if you haven't figured that out yet. WalkTheWeb. I know that was degrading. I apologize. Okay, so next, WTW WalkTheWeb database, and what you have in this class is there's an error class, so you can write your errors to the database, and it logs everything that you put in there. It's an easy way to see what's going on in the middle of something. You can just drop it into the error class. It logs it, date and time, and shows you what happened. But also I wrap most of my functions, if not all of them, in something that catches that S error. Yes, a lot of people overuse the word error, so I use S error, just meaning string error. Every time I use it, my tendency is to put what page it came from, including the path. So in this case, core functions class file name of which file it came from, and then I put the name of the function itself. This way, I can look in the error log. I see one entry that tells me what the error is and exactly where to find it. I go right to it. I can troubleshoot it and fix it as quick as possible. Next thing is I do have a couple easy functions in here, even though they're not database functions, but I tend to use them with my databases. For example, this one is used to get the query string, and in some cases I want to know if it's a number, and if it's not a number, I may do something like, if I say check number, I'm looking to make sure it's a number, and I assign it a value of 0 if it doesn't have a number coming back because I expect a number. But also if something's numeric, I don't want it to send something back unless it's numeric or read something in. Another thing is, here's the query function. Right now, I'm not doing a lot of scrub of data. I will scrub the data of whatever query you put in there before it executes it against the system. I'll protect everybody. Lesson learned from working with WordPress. Shout out to those guys. They got a great product. Yay. Okay, so I will scrub and do a check on the data before it runs every query. Right now, my main concern is making sure that when I run a query, everything is passing through this area, this file, these checks and stuff. Then I'll worry about what comes through and how to check it and everything. Another one I do is during my install, I check to see if the table already exists. If it doesn't, then I'll know so I can add the table to your database. And a lot of my key values are 16 alphanumeric characters, and so I have a random string function to create those characters. And I also have Google Analytics for tracking page views here because, well, if I put it here, it's one shot, it ends up everywhere. Okay, so that's what it has so far. I'm sure I'll build more onto this class as I go. For example, my query right now, it automatically creates a data array and returns the data array so that you can loop through it. I'll probably have some that just do an insert and all you want to know is that it was successful. We'll do that kind of stuff as it goes. The next thing is, well, that sums it up, because then the next thing is the www connect class. When I run these, a lot of the time I'm just passing it on to my error class. Like here, I pass the error to the error class in WalkTheWeb DB, which, of course, the error for the error is the error. Yeah, let's get that one. Okay, so if this can't pass it to the error class, it causes an error which gets to the error class. Okay, I can see where sometimes that just may not end up there, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Get value. Right now I have it doing its own get value and get number check. I'll pass those on to the other class because there's no reason for me to write the code twice, obviously, like I did here. It was one of those decisions where I decided to put it in the DB class because I use them all the time, and so I just haven't cleaned this page up yet. Get domains. I'm grabbing web aliases. This is actually not getting the main domain, but getting different web domains. This is so you can have aliases. So speaking of alias, this is an important topic. Everybody has domain names. Everybody already has www or without a domain name at all. I mean, without a prefix, a subdomain part of the thing. What I did is I'm designing the system to use 3D dot your domain name. That way you can have a www dot your domain name and a 3D dot domain name, and everybody will know what it is worldwide without having to ask you, what's your website, how does it find it? They can just actually type it in and see if it finds something. Okay, so discovery makes it really easy. And just a little subnote, I trademarked http://3d and https://3d. Now, I don't have a problem. Open source, you're going to be able to use them for free. Don't even worry about it. If somebody goes after it, tries to use it, we'll have to deal with that with lawyers in the future, and I don't want to even go there. So, not an issue, but I did design the system around using 3D dot and then your domain name. So it's going to be a requirement on this software, unless somebody hacks it and wants to, whatever, that's their deal. But I find it a good standard so that we'd be able to find sites. Like if you know that, hey, google.com, well then 3d.google.com would be their default site for 3D sites. Okay, so makes sense. And in this function, I pull all those different web aliases because you can have multiple web aliases pointed at a community. Now, community, reminder, it's your scene, it's your 3D scenes. So pointing multiple names at the same scene would give you the same results, but you could browse it as that different name. Opposed to a redirect where you're just pointing it at there, you can do that stuff in DNS or something. But in this case, I'm actually letting you browse it as multiple names, whatever names you want to assign to it. And I've got a couple other functions in here that I used, kind of one-to-many ratios where I bring up something and then want to find the data that goes with it. For example, if I'm drawing a line on a page, there may be many mold points. I bring those in. Another little word I just spoke there and I want to bring up right away as you're looking at my code. When I was coding this, starting at the very beginning, one of the things I found and just was kind of something I did to help separate my code from Babylon, since I'm using the Babylon engine and all these other sources. I found a word, mold, and I'm using it to be the equivalent of mesh in my code. The reason is, when I'm searching things or finding things or writing things, it becomes very easy to find out if you're dealing with something that's working with my code and kind of got a degree of separation between my code and anybody else's. So I'm using mold instead of mesh. Means the same thing. I use them pretty interchangeable, and I wouldn't be surprised if I messed up and used the other one a handful of times. But when you see it, you'll know what it is. It's not a big deal. The other one is materials. Gets used a lot in code. So when I create and package a material and put it on a mesh or mold, what I do is I call it a covering. Just a way that you can tell it's my wrapper around the actual material, opposed to calling the material directly. Because, as you'll notice, when in the code as we go, there's times when, let's say you move your mouse over something and I want to highlight that mesh, well, basically, it has to change the appearance of the material on it at that time. I want to know what my original covering is that I put there versus the mesh, the materials changes that I make to show you on the spot. So just a little thing, I wrapped material with the word covering, and that's kind of how I name them in my code. Those are pretty much the only two real dramatic naming scheme things I did. You'll get used to it. Or you'll argue with me, and eventually you'll tell me, okay, don't be stupid and change it to mesh. And if enough people say it, I'll give in and do it. Okay, with that said, the next thing is, okay, so I basically went through all of the different connect area, and I've gone through and done every one of those, so no matter which one it is, they have that same format, the same pattern. Same type of queries to the database. They use the same constants, and then they produce the JSON. Okay, so that section I've actually completed. And as you can tell, the class itself needs a little bit more work, and maybe I'll jump in right there, right now, just to finish it out and make sure that I'm consistent with what I'm doing. And then the next one that I'll go to after connect area is I'll jump in and I'll continue on working with the iframes. You know what? Before I jump in on coding, I better describe the iframes a little bit to you. Now, when you're working with a website and you want to keep the site alive, for example, the graphics, the animations, everything else that's going on the surface, at the same time you want to update data to the database, the way to do it is the easiest way to do it. And there's many ways to do it, but one of the ways that I chose to do certain things is by using an iframe hidden behind the canvas. So you've got your canvas, HTML5, that's what we're drawing on with Babylon. We're creating the scene that you're watching, we're doing the inputs, we're working with and everything else. What I do is when you need to input something, for example, you're changing a mesh on the screen and you're changing its shape and everything, well, when you do this, it's using a form that is kind of a display form. So when I have my forms directory here, these are your displayable forms. For example, like I said, mold instead of mesh. If I bring this up, here's all the fields that you'll find when you click on a mold and you edit it or you add a new one. For example, you have the position XYZ, you have the length XYZ in each direction, and you have the rotation XYZ in each direction, etc., etc., etc. I know, I'll try not to say etc. 3 times, it seems redundant. But when you use the form, it puts in the values. When you click submit, what I'm doing is I'm using JavaScript to write that information over to an iframe that controls that same type of stuff. For example, since I'm working with a mold, I go to the mold iframe. This iframe takes in the values from here, then submits a certain submit button that identifies itself. Then I'm reading in that submit data from here. Here it is, server request method post. I read in the values, and then I use the functions that are in my function directory over here. And there's one specifically for different classes, different things. So, so basically, it does that full loop. So we're using the forms for what you see, iframes behind the scenes, and then we're using the functions in those iframes so that the functions are reusable. If I work with molds on 4 different iframes, I can still just drop the function in there, the class, and I'll be able to use it. And with that said, so that kind of gives you the layout of those 3. Then there's, while I'm at it, last one on the list here is menus. Menus are my menu across the bottom of the screen, what they bring up, also my admin menu. This is where it pulls the different forms into these sections. So basically it's menu and it's admin menu, and those are the ones that you're going to find have the insert includes, so it'll have the include telling you which piece, which form to put in different places within that structure. So that's the structuring of the forms within the menus. Okay, so with all that said, I'm going to jump back, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up the function working with the connect class. I want to make sure it's just using since I'm already loading the database class, I want to make sure that these functions are just transmitting over there what can be done over there. The other part is making sure I'm not doing any actual direct database calls here. For example, I already corrected this one. It's using the global database, doing the query, and then for the results, I format how I want them to be, and then I return the values back to the code. So I've already done that part of it. Track page view. What I want to do here is global WalkTheWeb DB, and I'm going to, I know this is kind of redundant, but the reason is I want to be able to drop this connect page in any one of those connect files, and it automatically just uses that one class, and through the back end of the scene, I'm throwing it to the different classes that it needs to be. This will simplify when people want to do stuff. For example, if you're writing your code and you need to create a connect object, giving out some JSON, then basically you'd be able to drop it in there very easily and basically just use the one class, and it automatically assumes everything else it needs to make it work. Okay, and you can always add your own classes as needed too. So what I'm doing here is I'm just basically going to pass the value into the next thing. All my error trapping is already happening there, so I really don't need anything else on that area. Oh, if I also track my errors, I should do it this way. And you're going to also know, one of the things I tend to do a lot is copy and paste. Developer habit. And the reason I copy and paste, even though sometimes I could probably type it faster, is because typos can take a long time to find in code. And if I copy and paste things, then the tendency is I can get it there so fast that basically, without errors, just speeds along development. I don't have to spend so much time fixing things. Just like if I wrote a function and it worked really well for one thing, I may go grab it, copy it, and then just modify a few, whatever I need to make it work for another thing. Okay, we have get developer, and notice we have that, we do not have that one in the other class, so I'll leave that one right where it's at. But I am going to take the global, I'm going to move that into here. I don't even need it up there. Actually, I do have it there. So I'm going to make it here. I'm going to take it out of there. And I'm going to use that class for the error handling. Okay. Takes care of that one. Next one. Here we go with that. Take the global out of there. Here. And I don't even stick to my own things. Sometimes I do it anyway. And we're going to take that out of here. And next thing I'm going to do, put that, wrap the error tracking out of there. And here we go again. Okay, so we've got all those in place. And that one looks good now. I'm passing the things that I need to. I get the query string, I get random string, get number, get value, and you can set default values on there. You know, the one I don't have here is if I need to check a number. Oh, because I put it in here, I'll extend that one out. Oops. Check number. And all I'm going to do is take that, put it here. A little bit of consistency of what's available. And the only thing I have to do is global DB. Oops. And annotation and pass what comes in here. Oh, when I'm passing, the other thing I should do is, wait a minute, yeah. Forgot to do that on the last couple of them. We're returning what went passed through there in case anything comes back. Oops. still. Function query, data, I'm returning the data. You know something, why am I doing it that way? There's an easier way. We've got a query, global. Just do this. I swear I do make this stuff easier as I go. Return that query there. Take that out of here. No reason for error tracking. I'm returning exactly what went in. Same thing on this one. Take that out of there. Track page view. Does that have? There's not that many functions I won't have to search. That doesn't have a return function, so it doesn't matter. I want to use check, get name, get value. Okay. And I'm going to do the same thing with get random string. That was in there, right? Yep, get random string. Okay. So get random string. Return. We're just creating some paths through so that when somebody uses this function, it automatically just gives them back, passes it through to the other class. That keeps our classes in one place. I don't want to run the functions in multiple places. I don't mind calling the functions or even having a pass-through like this available so that we can streamline the call of functions, if that makes sense. But I don't want to duplicate efforts. If there's an error or change I want to make to the actual function, I'd rather find it in one place and use the core function so that I'm not going in and having to change 3 different places. Okay, so default color on that one.
Hi, do you have a travel card? We did.
Aw. You're okay, so coding here. And I'm going to take that one, and we're going to pass this back through also. And make sure we're passing it through there. Return that value, return these. So those are the dummies that just pass on through. And let me do it to this one because that looks weird the way I did that. Oh, that's why, because I used a string locally. Let's not do that. Let's just pass it to the other class. Okay, so that knocks out those ones, puts them over to here. And yes, I didn't loop myself up on this one because the first thing I do on this one is I have a public string for serror posed to the function for serror. That's not the brightest thing I've ever done in my life. String, how about serror text? There we go. That's better. Okay, so string error text, what I'm doing with this one is I'm going to tell it that if the serror function fails, it'll throw it to the text so I can read it back at that time and find out what's going on with this. Chances are if that's happening, it means your database wasn't available, and another issue there, which I'm actually checking when you first turn on the site anyway. So chances of that actually being run is slim to none. Okay, so we have Okay, so serror connect. Now we have that nice and streamlined. Okay, some detail stuff in there we'll get to later on. Next one is going to be the functions. Let's see, let's get to first one I had, just so that you know the match set here, is the iframe for action zones. And then we have the, oops, I don't need connect anymore. Okay, then I have the class for action zones, which is going to be used on that page. And of course I have the database one. Okay, so I have all three of these. The action zones iframe, first thing it does is call the class for iframe. iframe, that's the other one I wanted. Class iframe. Now, iframe, what I'm trying to do with this class is I'm trying to be the one call when you're doing an iframe, just like I did with the connect section, where if you're creating an iframe, you drop this one thing on there, and then you drop your specific class that runs the functions for your iframe. So kind of cleans it up. We automatically include the WTW-DBE, so WalkTheWeb database, and then we run a number of things from here. I'm initting the class because we are bringing up a separate page. There's certain things I want values to be populated the second you open an iframe. So for example, in this one, when I open the iframe, the first thing the class does, well, besides including the database, is it runs at the bottom of the page when it initiates instance. It runs the init class. Now in my init class, this is actually a very small file, but in the init class what I'm actually doing is I'm setting the default domain. If it doesn't have one set at the root level, then it automatically picks up one for your current domain. In fact, it sets it to whatever your current host is. The next thing is I check to see if it's HTTPS or HTTP, and I set the whole domain URL. The other thing is I'm checking the session to see if the user ID is logged in or not. What you'll see through all my stuff, all my coding, is that I use the session variables when I'm going to pass something that's going to save or call from the database, especially if it's not public information. I mean, connect, if you're connecting and pulling something from another site, that's another story. But when you're administering a site, I always pass the session variable for user ID. That way I know who did what and when. If it's not set, they don't have a session, they're not coming in, and that should pretty much help with one side of hacks that happen. But I'm checking different things on that, so we'll get there later on. I'll talk more about it. And those are the ones I'm setting for this particular page. There'll be a couple more I'll probably add to this as I go through all the various iframe pages that I have. Okay. And as you'll see, I've already set this one up where I have the functions automatically forwarding to the database version for their return values. Track page view does not have a return. I should return a positive. That would be a smart thing to do. So let's see, when you track the page view, we'll come in here. Okay, the correct way to do this would be, and let's say, success equals false. At the end of this whole thing, we're going to return success. But then during here, because it has all this stuff, we're going to set success equals true. And so success equals true only happens when it makes it through here and nothing catches an exception and ends up in an error. So as long as it makes it all the way to there, then we'll get returned a true value because it'll have finished running through that code. There are no returns before it. I made sure of that kind of thing. I don't want to, have an exit from the function sooner than that. So success equals true. Now we have a return value, which means we'll try to make all of our functions return value. That just kind of cleans them up and keeps them nice and neat. So in the connect one, I know I did the same thing there. While I've got it in mind, okay, track page view. We're going to return the value, or receive the return value, just so that we can pass it to the page here. Okay, so everything has a return value now. Okay, so that'll be consistent. We'll just make sure we do that from here on out. Okay, and that one collects, that's everything that's in this particular file at the moment. Okay, so what I was doing is I'm coming through here. What's happening is I set a couple local variables on that page. Get back to the post. I have those same variables written in as the values within a couple of the different characters, the ones that, that'll be passed on through the page or returned after the function happens. Now, this little JavaScript that I have at the end of my iframe pages, I've done this pretty common across all the pages. The reason I do this, this one doesn't have any return values, but what it does is it'll call a function on load, and it hits this function for being able to return your values or continue code in JavaScript after something gets submitted. So this is a very helpful thing. Like, for example, let's say I'm saving something and I don't know what the key value is going to be until after I insert it. Well, it inserts, it gets the key value. I can write it to one of these fields up in the page. Then I can tell the JavaScript here to run something from the parent page, pick a script, and pass that value using the DOM element. You'll see that on other pages, so I'm not going to go into it any farther at this time. But then once you, and then, okay, that's something, I just thought of something else. What I'd like to do is, let me show you, if I say, for example, save action zone, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find all within my code, just so that I can see. Okay, first of all, I found the page that I'm on, but then notice in my JavaScript page admin editor, there's a page that actually calls this function. What I've done here is, the first thing is, I set up the iframe, I call the iframe on the page. Notice, just to completely close the loop in your mind, admin page. In the admin page, at the bottom of the page, I have these various iframes. Each one loads a particular iframe page. And from that, for example, iForm edit action zone. This particular one uses that iframe's action zone page. So now you've seen the full loop of how it's actually bringing it in. The page has this running behind the actual render canvas right here. Okay, so I set up a variable for the frame. I make sure that I'm grabbing the content document. This right here has to do with different browsers. This works in all browsers the way it's written, so until I learn different, that's the way it's going to stay in my code. The next thing is I load up the elements on the iframe page based on values that I have in my JavaScript page, or as you notice, the form. These will bring in the values of the form. Now, here's another one of my little shortcuts that probably saved acres of code while I'm coding, but yet it's still understandable. I created a function in JavaScript. It's at the very top of the of my common JavaScript page, and what it does is it's dget. I use dget because that is equivalent to document period get element by ID. The reason is I use that so extensively through code so many times that it's so much easier to go dget, and yet it's still, when you look at the code, you haven't been in there yet or anything, you can look at the code and immediately know what you're looking at and what you want to do. So dget, yes, I know immediately, it's document, get element by ID. It's so common in code. If you do JavaScript, you already know that it's so common. As long as you understand my dget is that, you're good to go. So that just means document element get element by ID, and then T action zone ID. Another thing is most of my fields, which I'm trying to be consistent on, it starts with a T if they come from a form, just so that I know where they exist from. A little bit of a thing, I may have erred on that a couple times, but I do that, and then I try to be very consistent about, on the I page, calling it the exact same thing that I'm going to read in. There's some instances where that isn't going to work because of what I'm doing at the time. Maybe I'm reading in a value and then splitting it into 5 different fields before it hits the database. Whatever I'm doing, you'll see, you'll catch on to that very quickly. But I am trying to be very consistent so that you know if the form field had this, if I search for that in my code, for example, if I just bring up a search, find and across files for T access position X, what happens is I get my form, here's the values where I'm bringing them in, here's the iframes that I'm using on the page to read them into the iframe page. Then I have the script of where I write it to there, or I've set the initial values actually in that case. And then I have the admin editor page, any instance where I've used that particular code. So just by calling that one item, I can find everywhere in my code that has to do with pretty much that object on the screen. So simplicity in naming, simplicity in finding and tracking down. See, notice I didn't just track down where this value and where it is on the code, but I've tracked down the whole path of its use by doing it this way. Okay, so that helps out a lot with coding. Okay, next thing, where am I? Let's back up a couple steps here. Okay, so now that I've walked through those areas, then of course I have my functions. So what I did, this is a little trick of the trade I did. I'll use it until I find a better way that works in all browsers. But there was a couple browsers that have trouble when you tell it and you try to determine which button you've pushed on a form when you have multiple submit buttons. So one of the things I've done on here is when you click a submit button, you'll notice I have an on-click button click, and I'm setting a value. And that value is the exact same name of the button that I'm pushing. That JavaScript, it's actually very simple. In my prime, that's where you're going to find most of the code that works on all pages or a lot of pages. Common on iframe JavaScript, you're going to find one in here that's called b value. And let's see. I know I could have searched it faster than that. Button click, sorry, button click. And now button click works with the b value. What I'm doing is I'm finding out what the button value is, I'm making sure it's not null, and then I set it to, back on that same form, I set it to the b value field. Now by doing that, what I'm doing is I'm creating a loop of which value I passed. Notice it's got a string constant or string value going through here. I set it at when I first open the page when I don't have a value. I read in when I submit the post. I read back in that value, and I'm just passing it as a flow through. But then I can use that value to determine which functions to call based on what button you did. Now I've connected the dots between my JavaScript calling a particular button and executing a certain function. This becomes a little bit easier than different code for tracking it down. What I had, and when I originally did this, I was reading the button name using Chrome, and then all of a sudden I opened it in Firefox and it wouldn't read in the value no matter what I tried. And so after reading tons of Stack Overflow, hey, shout out Stack Overflow, you guys are awesome. But Stack Overflow, reading a bunch of options, this is kind of a trick that I came up with that works. And it works in all browsers, and it's worked like bulletproof. So until I find something that works better in all browsers, that's kind of how I'm passing them. So with that, the other part is on an exit. Let me find one that has a exit function set, just so you can see. First of all, it's iframes building. That's a good one. Okay, so using that same format, notice here. Okay, on the JavaScript, what happens is on load, it's reading this. Well, of course, this isn't doing anything because by value, when it's first going through, when it's not a post, that value comes up as blank. So this only happens after a submit. This area right here, by value equals, and then based on which button you've pressed from your JavaScript code, it tells it to run this following after everything's been submitted and the page is complete. So I'm working in my site. I tell it to save a form. The form goes on. People can continue moving on the site. The animation is still constant. Everything else. While they're doing all that, this goes back. It writes the values to the iframe from the form on the page that they viewed. It closes the form immediately, so they think it moved on. Everything else. But then this iframe in the back goes out, uses the function, saves the files to the server, then returns its, from the post, and then can execute something that can happen after the page is complete. So it creates a full loop back into JavaScript to complete or continue on what happens immediately when that function is done saving its value. So in many cases, let's say I saved a value, I found out what the prime key is for that particular database field. I can tell it, bring it here, put it back in, now write it back into my JavaScript code, maybe in an array of different elements that you've added. For example, products in your store. Let's say you have 20 products in your store and you're adding a physical product in your store. Well, now you can actually submit it through the database, get the value, bring it back in. Now write it to the array on the one that you used, kind of a dummy plug for a value, so that the page itself can continue as if you loaded it right then and there with the value already in place. So the initial load status. Now, there's a number of times where I have to do this when I'm writing code. The code itself, there's the appearance of what's happening on the canvas. There's the JavaScript arrays and different things that I'm using to track and manipulate what's happening on the canvas. That's the active screen, that's the active values. When I load a brand new page and I'm viewing the internet in 3D, that's the values you get in there right out of the database on initial load. When I change a value of something, let's say I change the color of the avatar. Let's say it changes color of his shirt. The idea behind it is there's an array of the avatar of what's currently being used on the screen. So when I change the color, I'm not only changing the physical color of what you see right then and there, which is the active array looking at the screen, I'm also going in, using this and doing the back end and saving the value. Now the idea is to make sure that when that process is complete, it ends up identical to as if you just loaded the page from scratch. You don't want to have a value in there that's, a dummy plug saying, hey, this is number 1 for my primary key table because I'm not using that in my array. And then all of a sudden you end up with the next value being number 2, but then as you're using it, when reload it, it turns out to be an alphanumeric 16-digit code. The idea is to be identical. The reason is there's other things that are going to act from other people's code on your objects. Not only that, to add a little complexity to that statement, there's times, for example, you add a chair around a table. But now, using that same design of the chair, you add 3 more chairs to the table. Not only do I have that same design of a chair with every component, mold, and mesh that made that chair, but I've instanced it so that I can tell the difference between the 4 chairs and each position of every mold within those chairs. So I know that was a mouthful. I'll get in more to that as I'm designing and showing you different sections of the code. But for now, that should give you a really good idea of why it's important to make sure that the arrays that run the site are always updated to be as efficient as if you just loaded it fresh out of the database. Okay, we need to make sure that's there because that also affects getting rid of stuff off the screen. And if you don't want the site to snowball where you're just building up more memory, adding more things until the site crashes, you have to be as efficient at getting rid of stuff as you put in things. Now, if you're naming the things correctly, you're naming, for example, I add something in there and I say it's going to be loaded this way. When I get rid of that loading area, I need to make sure your object that you added is gone also. That's the kind of stuff that can snowball if we don't get it right. I have a lot of safeties in place as I clean up the code and as I go through the code, clean up, check things and double check things and try to make it as efficient as possible. I may find ways to shortcut that and even make sure I'm doing even more error correcting around code you guys write and stuff. But for now, I just want to say it's as important as making sure that that is getting the final state of whatever the arrays are going to have in them if they were loaded fresh from the database. Okay, now I've got off on my little rant about that. Okay, let's go back to where am I on this? I'm going to close off that one for a moment. Okay, I'm going to close off that frame for a second. Oh, one peek at something here. A couple things I have in here. When I run this, first thing I do when I create my JavaScript ones is I actually create the function as WTW WalkTheWeb, and that calls my JavaScript function. There's only one thing: is this admin viewer, yes or no? The other parts, I've got a couple of variables in here that I'm running, but everything else comes in under prototype and gets added to the function after the fact. That way, it makes it very efficient for being able to, on the fly, add things to the JavaScript class. This will make it very convenient for when you guys need to add things or something across the board. It'll give you access to do it. Okay, so with that said, another thing that you're going to see in my code, and I'm just going to, since I just kind of glanced on it here, there's 3 functions here that I use a lot in my JavaScript. Well, 4, including the dget. We've already talked about that one. Another one is a straight out show inline, and a hide function. The reason is those items require multiple lines of code. It also requires, setting things, knowing where they are at what case, seeing if the actual object exists. So what I did was I created little functions that, first of all, when you pass in the name of an element on your JavaScript page, for example, on the form, the idea is don't show them any more than they need to see at any one point in time. That's keeping it simple. So in here, what I do in my code is I use the word show, and then I can just say the name of something, and I can, boom, automatically show it on the page. In this case, I do capital WTW period show, and then the name in the brackets, parentheses. And basically, the first thing it does is it checks to see if that name's valid. So if the name doesn't exist on the page currently, it won't error out on you. It doesn't do anything. It kind of traps that. The next part is, if it does exist, it's going to set it to block and visible with its display and visibility. Right now I have a little extra thing in here from an admin menu thing. Don't worry, as I get going, I'll be cleaning that out so it won't exist later on. Show inline, just change the display to inline block, but does effectively the same thing. And hide changes display to none and visibility hidden. It's a quick way to say WTW period hide and then put something in the parentheses of whatever name of the element that you want to not show on a page. Okay, next thing is, let's see, we have things like get JSON. I do asynchronous calls so that it doesn't affect all the animation on the page and stuff. If you're noticing your JSON calls start to cause trouble with things loading and causing pauses, it's because of how much you're loading at a time, not the JSON call itself. JSON calls are checked out, they do work. Try to bring it back in numerous calls so that it spreads it out. You can try to bring back, fragments of the data so you can break it up, or pass the information you need to call something else that will pass the rest of the data. So kind of daisy chain a little bit on your loading if necessary. That'll keep everything running smooth. In the early stages of what I was doing in creating the site and doing the animation and trying not to make it pause, that's where I learned quite a bit about doing that stuff. But I do know that the getJSON itself, asynchronous calls, do not stop the animation from working. So with that said, try to manage how much you're bringing back in any one time. Text data is cheap. Blob data is expensive on that. Another thing is I do have a way of doing a quick log. Console log. I run my own function only because I can quickly select a color without typing in this whole thing every single time. So what I do is WTW period log, and then in parentheses I say what text I want. So I can tell it to spit out a value if I want to see it in my display. I can tell it a comma and then a color. If you leave that blank, it'll automatically give you black. So that way I can decipher between different things I see, and I can bring them out really quick. I use those a lot. You'll see throughout my JavaScript code, anywhere you've got it, at the end of every function, no matter where it's at, I do the error catching just like I do my S error in PHP. I do an error log this way. The good news is it tells you what file it came from, like in this case, admin editor, and then submit action zone form. That is the function that caused the error. Helps you track it down real quick. You go right to that. You can find out where the error is happening, read the error, check out the code, put in a couple markers, whatever you have to do to find it. But it's another way of tracking the code when you need to track the code and running the code without errors to the customer, the consumer, the user when they're using the site. So it's just kind of my error trapping. And just so you know, in the config file, one of the things I have in there is specifically dev mode. Dev mode equals 1, or it can be 0 or anything else you want, but that turns off and on the flag to track errors and to give you extra information. If you turn that off, a lot of these errors will be hidden so that the user looks at it and doesn't see it working. So when you go to prod in your site, you can switch this to 0, and basically you're trapping the errors, you can see what's going on, but at the same time they can't. You can just, it's a way of manipulating it. Okay, with that said, and as you can see, I have a dget function that's just raw without being wrapped within the wrapper, but I also have it in the function just so that they're both ways. Didn't make a lot of sense to have dget and then have to do wtw period dget every single time. By then I could have just typed document.getElementById, and yeah, so you know the drill. Okay, with that said, moving on. Okay, so those are my iframe things I use. Let's get rid of the admin page right now, admin editor. Just backtracking a little bit here. Okay, so that's the class of the iframe. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of these different things we're going to run across. First of all, the first one that you're going to see as I'm going through these iframes is we have buildings, communities, and things. Quick reminder on that. Communities are your scenes. Buildings are basically isolated areas within your scenes. It can be a physical structure of a building, it could be a bridge, it could be any object you want. It could be an open field just that you want to control when you, like let's say I built a soccer game. I could say it's a building and then make a field, a soccer field. That's my building. That's my defined area within a 3D scene. Buildings, the reason for this is buildings have different ways of loading when you walk near it, opposed to a scene, which you need the whole scene kind of to exist when you start up. Okay, with that said, moving forward, I know I say with that said a lot. I'll have to see about stopping that. Next thing is we have things. Things are your objects within your building and within your 3D community scenes. For example, I can have a tree. I can have a plant. I can have a tree in a planter and put it in a building. I can put a tree in a building if I wanted to. I can make it attached to like a soccer field. I could have an empty field that's a building. I can have a tree in that building, which means when I walk up on the soccer field, the tree is next to the field, giving people shade in the stands. I can make these different things, anything you want, and you can attach them to either a building level of loading or a community level of loading. The reason for doing different sections like that is to control how much gets loaded at any one point in time. We're trying not to max out the memory and be able to walk around the scene with dynamically loading and unloading of objects as you move. The goal is a smooth transition of being able to walk from one website to the next, defining each building or thing as their own websites. So, using that information, what we have is, if I create a 3D community, and which is my scene, and I load it up. Now, I have a particular place on that community that I want to load a building. So what I do is, in my logic order of items that we're working with, is I create a connecting grid. A connecting grid is a 1 by 1 by 1 cube that's invisible, but it identifies where the position, the scaling, and the rotation of where I'm going to put a building or thing in that community. Okay, so because I'm using this 1 by 1 by 1 cube, the building itself is attached to that cube. So as I scale the cube to, let's say, 2 by 2 by 2, the building itself, everything about it gets scaled 2 by 2 by 2 mesh-wise. This allows you to create a scene and then go, hey, I put this building here. Ooh, it's just not lining up with my streets, or I needed to fill up just a touch more space. So you can make it 1.03. Now it fills the gap that you needed it to fill to make your scene perfect. It gives you that little bit of flexibility, just enough to make a scene. Or, for example, I want to create a scene, and in it, you're going to walk up to a table and see a model of my building on the table. Well, guess what? I scale it down to a 10th scale. Now it's sitting on the table. And as you walk up on it, those same areas load up and unload as you walk up on the table. Amazing. Okay, so connecting grids are the point in time in the space of where you want this item to exist. Okay, so when you load up your scene, it automatically brings back all of these connecting grid points and plots them out on the scene. The next step is, so that doesn't take too much weight for the computer. It can handle a straight cube, no issues. I could have made it just a point instead of a cube, and I may switch to that just to save 6 sides of a cube that is invisible to begin with. But considering the Babylon engine isn't actually drawing it, we're all fine. Oh yeah, and the scalability, duh. Okay, so we got the connecting grids in all their places. Now the next thing is I need a frame of reference of how close you are to the connecting grid. So the next thing is the action zones. Action zones are invisible cubes or any shape. It can be a sphere around something. But what happens is it's an invisible mesh that when you walk inside, we can detect if a user has crossed that threshold and walked inside of it. So action zones are where I want to trigger some type of response. There's action zones for load zones. So when I walk within this box on the screen, this cube, it'll automatically tell it to trigger a load event, which goes out, gets all the meshes that are defined with that load zone, and brings them back and displays them on the screen. An example of that one, let me show you that one, because that's a core of some of the stuff I'm doing. So let me bring okay, I'm going to bring the website up here. And first thing is I'm going to log in, just because I want to go to admin mode. There's some features in admin mode that are obviously not available in browsing mode. One of them in particular is, I should have just gone to now that I've logged in, I can go to the admin site. Okay, so I'm going to go to this admin site here of my current homepage. The other thing is, just to make sure nobody's joining me in this, I'm going to turn off my multiplayer settings, and I'm going to turn multiplayer off. Okay. Oops. Okay, so what I have here is my admin. This is the admin menu on the left side. And make sure, yeah, I've got you showing on the other side. Good. One of the things I have are these quick editor settings in the bottom corner. And one of the options is zones are off. If I turn them on, what happens is you see all of the loading zones within a given area. Each one of these shaded boxes are a load zone where it triggers to go out and load something, meshes. Now, as I'm walking forward, I'm tripping different load zones. Some are loading benches on the side, some are loading trees. This is a little confusing. Let me show you in a building by itself. I think it's important to see this step. And I have a lot of buildings, but let's see. Okay, going down to, I think I did test this yesterday, and I don't have more than one test this, so that's a good sign. Okay, first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to come in here and first thing, okay, options and settings, set starting position so that I'm facing this way at this particular place, right where whenever anybody comes into the scene, that's exactly where you'll be. Now I'm going to use one of my tools and I'm going to turn avatar camera off. The reason for that is now I can move the camera just by using my mouse. I can hold down the left mouse button and turn and move my camera, and it's separate than my avatar, so he's kind of not in the way. If I use the scroll bar on my mouse, it'll zoom in and out of whatever you're doing. Now, when I'm building something, it's designed to take control of the position that you're using. So the first thing I'm going to do is come over here, get building information, and go to Edit 3D Building. I can create building blocks. For example, a box on the screen. Now within this, okay, something's going with that. Okay, little change of plans at the moment, and just for reasons of insanity, I will be swapping out. I got another computer. I'm going to swap it out, get more RAM in this thing, and so that we can open that at the same time. For now, okay, let's stick to coding. The idea behind it is this. I can have an object, and I can load these different action zones based on where the connecting grid is. These action zones, the default ones are a normal size, a high size, and an extreme size. The reason for 3 different action zones right from the start is that when you open up a scene, if I don't see that there's something over there, if I don't see something off in the distance, I don't walk towards it. So the extreme zone is used to let you know there's something over there. It could be the profile of a building. It could be the main element of the rooftop. It could be the general shape of the item. It could be anything you want. It gets loaded when the extreme load zone gets loaded. That way, I'm walking into this scene, I know, hey, there's something over there. Now I'll walk closer to it. As you're walking closer and you start to approach it in a distance still, I have a high extreme zone, which is designed to show you more detail on the outside of the building. So as I'm getting close enough to make it worth my while, now all of a sudden, hey, we put in the windows, we put in the glass, we put in, different pieces into the scene that as you walk up to it, you want those in place. If I'm walking down a street, this may also include window shopping, the items that are in the front window that you want to see as you walk by, to let people know, hey, I got something over here I'm selling, maybe walk inside my store and go shopping. Those kind of items belong in the high zone. Then I have the normal zone, which is just barely bigger than the inside of the building dynamics. So if you built a building that was 20 feet by 10 feet, this is going to be about 22 feet by 11 feet-ish. And the reason for that is just before you open the door or just before you start to approach inside, it may be a little bit bigger than that. But as you start to go into it, all the things on the inside get loaded so that you can get, you walk inside, maybe there's some stairs, maybe there's some displays, maybe there's some products on the shelf. That doesn't happen until you commit to going inside. Now, another thing tied to the action zones is because I'm using this method, I also tied Google Analytics to the action zones. If I see it from a far extreme distance, I can actually write back to, in fact, my code writes back to Google Analytics saying it was loaded the extreme zone. Then as I got closer, hey, they got close enough to see the high zone. Then if I decided to walk inside, hey, you did the normal zone, which means you walked inside the building and it fully loaded. When you're looking at your Google Analytics, you can tell, did the thing that was extreme attract their attention and get them to look towards me? Did they walk close enough that it loaded the next level, which is the high zone? Did the high zone attract them as they're walking by on the sidewalk to look towards it and go inside and do some more shopping or do some more looking? That gives you at least a sense of 3 different levels of analytics telling you what you need to work on to improve getting people into your business, into your store, into your game, into whatever you're building. So analytics is important, and action zones are tied directly to the analytics. Okay, so we have connecting grids are the points where they're doing in the scaling and orientation. That also means if I have a scene and I put this building right here, I can take another one of those same buildings and put it over here at a different orientation, position, and scaling. Excuse me. Okay, so this is allowing it to instance. Not only can I put multiple buildings in the same scene, so let's say you have Starbucks on every corner. Good example. You can have one on this corner, go down 2 blocks on your site, and you can have another one on this other corner. It allows it to instance within one scene. So when you look at the actual table in the database and you bring up connecting grids, and then I'll go ahead and bring that up here. The connecting grids themselves, I'm just going to bring back a little sample data. First of all, they have an ID. Then they have the parent ID, which is going to be in some cases the community. Oh, for her example right here, we have one that this is the community it's in, and this is the child ID, which is the building within that community. It can be another thing of that same community, and then we have a thing in that community, or we have a building, a different building in the community, or we have another instance of the same thing. So the connecting grid is the instance. It becomes the instance identifier of which one you're dealing with. So that allows me to, when you click on a building, if you have 3 of the same buildings in a scene, I can move it around and do it. Now, because they're separate objects, you can also have a full another community and drop that same building in it. Now, with that, this is the 3D browsing really coming into effect and the designs of what I've done. Because you have 2 different scenes with the same building in it, I can open up the building itself by browsing the building instead of the scene. And if anybody walks into my store, for example, let's say I've got a 3D store and I'm working that store. If I open it using the 3D building instead of the scene, I get any person who walks into my building, I can see them even if they're in different communities. They won't see each other unless they're in the same community, but I can see them both as they come into my store. So I take my building, let's say it's a 3D store, and I get as many people as I can to add my store to their community. I want a Starbucks on every corner. I want to be that Starbucks. Well, I get it out there. Well, not only with this whole dynamic of the way I've set this up, not only will you have one store that you can work by opening the building directly in the browser, every person who walks in from any one of those communities will show up in your store and you can talk to them. You can sit there and talk with them and work with them. You can type in what you're going to be able to do is type in a key as you're helping them, and it'll change everything in their instance on the shelves around them, but not affect anybody else. So if somebody comes in and they're looking for a pair of socks, you go click, 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 boom. They're seeing changes around them, and all the products around them are socks. Another person comes up to you and they say they're looking for a lampshade. Lampshade, whatever it is. They can go in there and you can type in something, boom, 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 hit an enter, or we can extend it to them. Hey, the kiosk is right there, type in your own search. They type it in, click, all the products around them on the shelves become that item. If they've got a question, you're there as an avatar physically working the store. You can have that person, the avatar, interact with people, click on it, chat with them, talk with them. Eventually we'll have it where you can do voice chat right then and there, so you're talking to the people physically walking in your store. Here's a little catch, if you're text chatting with them, we can use some different tools and actually have it translate so that if they're not even the same language as you, you will get it in your language when you see it in the chat. So there's some technology things that we can put out there in the future in plugins. Hint to your developers to help create plugins. And then the other part, though, is all these people, you're working your store. How about the fact that you could hire somebody to work in your virtual store? We're talking virtual jobs. We're talking about putting people to work, giving them a job where you sit at home working in this particular store, and every time somebody comes in, you talk to them and interact with them and chat with them. Talk about equivalent of streaming a game for a job. We're talking about, hey, talk to people as they come in. This would be the new 3D social network. Another idea for a plugin. People can do a plugin for 3D social network. Become famous for it. I don't care. Become the next Facebook. Use this as a background behind you. Create a plugin. Every server that, picture this, every server on the internet that uses WalkTheWeb, that uses your plugin and puts it on their site to be part of the social network, your social network now physically is in those parts of the internet because it exists everywhere you run that plugin. See, we can world dominate. Come on. Yes, take over the world. Binky in the brain. No, my favorite. Okay, so back to it. Connecting grids are those connecting grids. Action zones are the pieces that load it. Then we have the next important part is meshes. When I started building this product, one of the things I know is I created a table and I called it molds and I said, throw everything in there. And by the time I created community molds, building molds, thing molds, and started building a ton of different objects, that table grew extremely fast, very short time. So what I did was I broke them down logically in the code by thing, building, or community in 3 separate tables. Now, as for a coder, that takes a little more effort. That makes you control which one you're working on at any one time, and it creates 3 different tables. But for most people on the internet, I don't want you to have to create a separate instance for your SQL server. I don't want you to have to create this huge amount of resources dedicated to the SQL server to work. But by breaking it down into 3 tables, it was enough that it split the load into 3, and you don't need separate tables now. You don't need, you need separate tables. You don't need separate, you don't need a separate server for SQL. You'll be able to handle the load with no problem at all, running right alongside everything else. Web server can have it. It can all be in one instance, just like you do WordPress. So learning experience, you're going to see community molds, you're going to see building molds, and you're going to see thing molds. They have the same structure in the database, the exact same fields. They use the same form in the code to collect the mold information, the mesh information. You get, so it's using the same fields. When it goes to save it to the database, that's when it breaks it down into, like, notice I have a mold iframe. That's when I do a check to see, are you using a thing? Are you using a building? Or was it a community that you're working with? And based on that, I send it to the respective functions going to that particular table. Okay, so there's common things spread across it, but then there's also separation in key areas. These were all learning experiences. I made a SQL slow down too much by using it a heck of a lot, creating so many objects. I created hundreds of buildings just to see what it would look like a couple years down the road. And what I found was you end up with trouble. You end up slowing down. But by separating them, everything works fine. So trial and error, learning experience, growth. There's some other parts here. First of all, the buildings themselves, the communities themselves, and the things themselves directly have a number of properties associated to them. You can name the community. I have what you call a publish name, which is the segment of the URL. The URL, in general, I know I'm kind of like word dumping right now to get started on this, because I'm expecting if people want to get familiar with the code, this is going to be the one that if you watch this, you got the layout of the land. Because in future days, I'm going to be jumping in specific purposes. I'm going to be coding on a particular page, and I may give you a couple reminders of what it is, but overall, you're not going to get an overview like this again just for every day of my coding. It'll take too long. So, communities, publish names. What I did was, the publish name works this way. You can have a default server, and you can set a default community to load when they come to your name without a community set. So, if I go to a website, and the first thing I do is, I go in there and I say, 3d.walktheweb.com, and just leave it alone. It's going to look in my config file, and it's going to see, did you load a default domain? Actually, a default community. I don't have it listed there yet. Let me go to where I've already got that added. I haven't set it yet because I'm still running the install process, which will take you through that. But for my WalkTheWeb site, nah, I'm not going to open that in front of you. My apologies, but you're going to have one that says default. Instead of default domain, it says default community and also default building. Default community is the most important one. When you come in under a certain site, for example, if I go 3d.walktheweb.com, because it came in not identifying which community to use, I let you set one. That 16-digit alphanumeric number looks in the database, sees if it exists. If it does, it will load that community when you come in with the name with nothing else. Now, if you take the name 3d.walktheweb.com / the very first path is a word friendly where you can actually say HTTP 3D, for example, and you will open up HTTP 3D publish name in the database, and it will find out which community that is, and it'll show you that, and it'll browse that community. So in the names themselves, they're tied in to that level. Community is the first level of the path. The second level of the path is the building. So you can actually bring open a specific building by, if you want to do the building only, you do 3d.walktheweb.com / building. And I also covered you in case you said buildings instead of building. They do the same thing. / and then the name of your building by its published name, then it'll bring open the building without the scene. That is going to become a very useful key if somebody else on the internet, without knowing you, wants to put your building in their community. They're going to be able to type in the URL of your 3d.domain name / building / and then the name of your building that you advertise to, hey, add this building to your site. They will be able to type in just that, put it in, and it'll make the connection, and it'll work across the sites. Okay? That's how it becomes distributable. We give a friendly URL, they type it in, it knows which building to load. You can have multiple communities that way on one server. You can have multiple buildings on one server. You can attach a web domain name, to a particular community. So that means one community can be multiple domain names. You can have buildings that use that domain name. So if I'm hosting and I've got 3d.walktheweb.com, but my corporation uses 3d.http3d.net, I can have both of those hosted under the same instance. All I do is create a different community for each one, or do the same community and put you directly in front of the building. Now, when you browse the site, using it all together with the pieces that I've just told you, if you typed in 3d.walktheweb.com / the community is http3d, now you add the building. When you browse that, you start at the default location for that building, which means standing right in front of it. Or inside, looking at a certain angle, whatever you want to set that place to. If you go to the same community again, but type a different building name, you could start in that same community in front of a different building. So now you have the ability to basically put your building. I'm selling 3D glasses, okay? I put my building into a community. I not only can use the default if I don't say anything, like if I just call my community, it'll put me in the default location starting that community. Might be at the beginning of a street where you're walking up to it. It could be in front of a particular place I want you to see. Anywhere I want to set the starting point. Then, if you use a slash and you put a particular building, that person would show up in front of a different building. But if I have, let's say my building, somebody else puts it in their community, I can find my, let's say it's a big community. We're talking huge community, big city, all these buildings, thousands of places to visit. All I have to do is type in the name of my building, or the name of the community, slash the name of my building that has the published name for it, and I start right in front of my building. When they use it, I can report back to you what that published name is in case it changed. Let's say you have two locations, they can't be the same published name. So by doing that, it allows you to get a list on your site. When you see your building there, you could go, I got a list right here, and it says, here's all my buildings. Okay? You can completely see every location of where it is installed, where it's put. You can click the link and go visit that place and see how it looks, what's around it, what did they put in that community near you. You get the complete option of interfacing, going back and forth, seeing where they are and how they all connect. Google Analytics, once again, enforces that because in your Google Analytics, you're going to get not only the community it sits in, but how much did they load it? Did they see it from a distance? Are they getting close to my building? Is it, if you see it from a distance and you're not attracting the customers, maybe there's something you can do to improve that. If they're seeing you close up and they're not going inside, change your window displays. Maybe you need to get their attention a little better. Or you find out, you go visit that site and find out, oh, it's a racing game. They're going by very quick in the street. It never has a chance to see what's in the window. Maybe that's where you're placed. So maybe you want to get moved where you're at the end of the race or the beginning of the race where people are standing there waiting to race and can see your stuff. These are the kind of things that you can find out by knowing where your building is and looking at the analytics. One last thing I'm going to say about analytics and about buildings. Well, I'm going to say a whole lot more things about analytics and buildings, but one more thing I'm going to say right now is how many of you out there like banner ads? Nobody, right? A successful banner ad gets about 1% of people clicking on it, and if you're anything like me, page pops up and you go, oh, I need that, and all of a sudden some banner ad pops up and loads and ends up right in front of you and you click on it by accident. Yeah, 1%, and how many of those actually wanted to go there? So, with that in mind, this here, we're putting the actual business in the place. We're taking the business, we're putting them in the community. You get the advertisement by walking down the street and seeing the business there. There are no need to take up some of your space on your screen where you can no longer see what you're trying to do, play the game or whatever it is. It's not going to be there. We're going to be anti-banner ad. Everybody repeat after me. Anti-banner ad. We don't want to see banner ads. So, totally, yes, you got that right. The idea is no banner ads. We're going to put the businesses in there, and if they attract attention, they attract attention. We're going to get away from the dynamic of advertising through banner ads. I'm not saying that isn't going to be out there. You got it all for the traditional internet. But in 3D internet, you want my attention? Make a good store. Make a good game. Give it to me something that I want to walk up to and actually play. For example, you got a golf game? Okay, on the tee-off area, hey, just like in real life, you could put a banner next to the tee-off area saying sponsored by XYZ. That's the kind of advertisement I don't mind seeing because I'm used to seeing it in real life. So the idea is we get it out of the, we're not going to even put it in the 3D world to begin with. Okay, so coming up on a 2-hour push here, I'm going to take a break, and I want to thank all of you for tuning in with me and listening to my rant and rage and showing you around a little bit on the designs that I'm doing. Here on out, you're going to see me come and go. I'll be logging on, I'll be logging off, I'll be taking breaks, I'll be coming back. When I'm coding, I'm jumping in coding, and I'm going to be showing it to you. So as I'm coding, you'll see me online. Join me, follow me, and as I'm coding, we're going to make this open source. If you see something, jump in there and tell me, hey, look, there's a better way. I'm no expert coder. I'm a good coder. I'm the best I can be, and I get things done, and I end up finding good ways to do them. Accident or on purpose, whatever way it happens. I'm not too proud to admit that it happens by accident. Okay, so what I'm saying is follow me so you'll know when I'm on. Otherwise, every single Monday at noon, I'm going to do a broadcast that gets you caught up and show off a little bit of the latest stuff we've done, give you an update on the project, do some Q&A. That time's for you. Monday at noon, starting at Monday at noon. We'll stay as long as we need to. We'll talk to you. We'll answer your questions. But dedicating that time to that type of activity. In the meantime, I'll be coding. You'll see me come and go. I want to thank you very much for tuning in, and follow me so you know when I'm online again. Thank you very much. Have a great day.